This is a lecture by L. Ron Hubbard given on the 20th of August, 1954. The title of this lecture is Axioms, Part 1. This lecture is 29 minutes long. Reproduced by Golden Era Productions.
I would like to talk to you now about the axioms of Scientology. There's considerable to be known about these. The axioms were first developed in this science a great many years ago, 2 years, 3 years ago. And since that time, there have been considerable changes. The changes are all in the direction of simplification. At present, we are operating with 50 axioms and definitions. The original list was considerably in excess of 290. And this list of 50 is both better and simpler and more workable, of course. Now, what are these axioms and how do they apply? Are they something that you're supposed to read and say, well, I understand that, and turn over the page, and, well, I understand that? No, I'm afraid that isn't the case. You who are in training on this particular subject are not expected to read them. You're expected to absorb them. You're expected to be able to quote them verbatim, by number, the exact words, the exact meaning, and much more important than that, you're expected to understand them. Now, let's take a look at these axioms and find out what they compare to. Actually, they compare best, perhaps, to the axioms of geometry. They are certainly as self-evident as that, but the axioms of geometry are really much cruder than these axioms, since geometry proves itself by itself, and the axioms of Scientology prove themselves by all of life. Now, in geometry, we have the Aristotelian syllogism being used continually, and we do not use this. We use a much better platform on which to base our understanding. If something doesn't work in Scientology, we change it and find something more workable. We are not bowed down to the great God, no change. Now, I know some of you watching this work going forward for the last 4 years or so certainly would agree with that very wholeheartedly, that we were not completely yoked by the motto, no change. And so we have today 50 axioms and definitions. Now, Webster says that an axiom is a self-evident truth. Well, true enough, these are self-evident, but they are not so thoroughly self-evident that they leap out of the page and introduce themselves. You have to introduce yourself to them. The first of our axioms is a bit of understanding which, if you do not have it and do not comprehend it, you won't be able to do anything with Scientology. I mean, it's just as blunt as that. The first one, if you don't have it very well, and if it's something foggy, so that somebody came up to you and said, what is life? And you said, well, now let's see, it's something to do with electricity. No, it's a static. I mean, I heard once there was a rumor that, let me see. Well, of course I know what life is. No, you don't. Man has been saying that for 10,000 years. Well, it has something, I guess, I understand. No, we're not doing that in Scientology, and that's why we succeed in cases. Life is basically a static. That's the first axiom. Life is basically a static. What is a static? Static is something which does not have mass. It does not have a location in space. It does not have a location in time. It does not have any wavelength. Now, that's what a static is. This static, however, life is a very peculiar static. Very, very peculiar static. And that is, it has the ability to postulate and perceive, and it has qualities. Now, that you won't find in your textbook, but until you get over to R240, their dissertation there. But it's nevertheless very true that life is capable of qualities. Those qualities are best found in the top buttons of the chart of attitudes. Now, you say, well, all right, then how can you measure it? Well, you can measure it. When you find something that has no mass, no location, and no position in time, and which has no wavelength at all, the inability to measure it will tell you that you have your hands on life. Now, the funny part of it is out of this static, all other phenomena extends. So naturally, you cannot measure a thing by its own phenomena. Space comes from this. You could say life is a space, energy, object, production, and placement unit. You could say that, and that would be equally true, because that's what it does. But I tell you, you would not try to measure a dog by his biscuits. And as a result, why people cannot measure this static by the phenomena extending from the static. Well, now, number two, if you have number one down very thoroughly, and you should be able to give quite a dissertation on number one. Number two, the static is capable of considerations, postulates, and opinions. It also has qualities, you understand. Something, in other words, a life form, a thetan, let us say, who is very, very close to being pure static. He has practically no wavelength. He's in a very, very small amount of mass. Actually, a thetan, due to some experiments conducted about, 15, 20 years ago, thetan weighs about 1.5 ounces. Who made these experiments? Well, it was a doctor made these experiments because he weighed people before and after death retaining any mass. He weighed the person, bed and all, and he found that the weight dropped at the moment of death about 1.5 ounces, some of them 2 ounces. Those were heavy thetans. Anyway, we have this thetan capable of considerations, postulates, and opinions. Well, now, the most native qualities to him, in other words, the things which he is most likely to postulate, are these qualities which you find as the top buttons, chart of attitudes. In other words, trust, full responsibility, all that sort of thing. So, we have then actually described a thetan when we have gotten axioms 1 and 2. And if you ever miss this, then you're going to have an awful hard time exteriorizing somebody. Because if you think that you reach in with a pair of forceps and drag him out of his head, this is not true. What you do is you exteriorize something that can't possibly be nailed down. That's quite a trick, isn't it? A thetan has to postulate he's inside before you can postulate that he's outside. But if he has heavily postulated that he's inside, now your trick as an auditor is to what? Override this thetan's postulates? Well, maybe you could do it by hypnotism. Maybe you could do it with a club. But the way we do it in Scientology is a little more delicate. We simply ask him to postulate that he's outside. And if he does and can, why, he's outside. And if he can't, why, he's still inside. Now, thetans think of themselves as being in the meshed universe. Of course, this is a joke, too. They can't possibly be in a universe. But they can postulate a condition, and then they can postulate that they cannot escape this condition. Of course, they can't be in the universe. Now, let's take up 3. Space, energy, objects, form, and time are the result of considerations made and or agreed upon by the static, and are perceived solely because the static considers that it can perceive them. The whole secret of perception is right there. Do you believe that you can see? Well, all right, go ahead and believe that you can see, but you'd certainly better believe that there is something there to see, or you won't see. So there are 2 conditions to sight, and they are covered immediately in that. You have to believe there's something there to see, and then that you can see it. And so you have perception. All of the tremendous categories of perception all come under this heading and are covered by that axiom, so you'd better know that axiom very, very well. Now, number 4, we get number 4 here, that space is a viewpoint of dimension. Do you know that physics has gone on since the time of Aristotle without knowing that? Yet we read in the Encyclopedia Britannica many years ago, I think it was the 11th edition, maybe even the 9th edition, and it says there that space and time are not a problem of the physicist. They are the problem of one working in the field of the mind. And it says that when the field of psychology solves the existence of space and time, why then physics will be able to do something about it. And all these fellows running around getting their PhDs and DHPs and so forth and studying all these centuries, not centuries, actually merely decades. It seems like centuries if you've ever listened to their lectures. The days of want, the only want, back in, I think, 1867, something like that, on forward, nobody read the Encyclopedia Britannica and realized that they had the responsibility for identifying space and time so that physics could get on its way. And because they avoided this responsibility, we had to pitch in here and dig up Scientology. Now, we didn't dig up Scientology to work in the field of physics. We dug up Scientology to work in the field of the humanities. But it so happened that I discovered very, very early while I was studying nuclear physics at George Washington University that physics did not have a definition for space, time, and energy. It defined energy in terms of space and time. It defined space in terms of time and energy, and it termed energy in terms of space and time. In other words, it was going around in a circle, and things were being defined by each other. Now, I first moved out of that circle by putting it into human behavior, be, have, and do, or be, do, and have, which you'll find in Scientology 8008, which you can get from the HASI. But the point is here that without a definition for space, physics was and is adrift. And one of our auditors, by the way, told somebody, an engineer in an atomic energy commission plant one time, well, we had the definition for space, and this engineer said, you do? And, of course, we didn't invent this for nuclear physics, but they could certainly use it if they could read. And so this fellow said, well, what is the definition of space? And our auditor said, it was Wing Angel. He said, space is a viewpoint of dimension. This fellow sat there, and then all of a sudden, he rushed to the phone, and he says, close down number 5. He realized that an experiment in progress was about to explode. And one of the reasons he knew it was about to explode is he'd suddenly found out what space was. It's quite interesting. This is of great interest to nuclear physics, but they get one of these definitions and then they start figure. They don't take the definition as such and use it as such. They figure, and so they lose it again. When you work R240 as a process, you'll understand exactly why they lose it every time they get hold of one of these definitions. Now, I'm not being very kind to these people, but then I don't feel very kind today. Anyway, I write my emotions too. Now, number 5, energy consists of postulated particles in space. Now, we got space. Space is a viewpoint of dimension. You say, I am here looking in a direction. Now, we've actually got to have 3 points out there to look at to have 3-dimensional space. We only have linear space if we have 1-dimension point. All right. The next thing is that energy consists of postulated particles in space. In other words, we demark these 3 points out there to have 3-dimensional space. We say there's energy. Particles. All right. There, we call those anchor points in Scientology. Now, the next thing, objects consist of group particles. Now, if we just kept putting particles out there and pushing them together, or if we suddenly said there's a big group of particles out there, we'd have what is commonly called an object. Now, when an object or a particle moves across any part of a piece of space, in other words, a viewpoint of dimension, we have motion. And so we get axiom number 7. Time is basically a postulate that space and particles will persist. That's all. That's its first postulate. Time in its basic postulate is not even motion. You understand? I mean, it's not even motion. The apparency of time, an agreed upon rate of change, becomes agreed upon time. But for an individual all by himself, time is simply a consideration. And he says something will persist. That's all he has to say, and he has time. Now, if he gets somebody else to agree what is persisting, why, the two of them can then be in agreement, and if those 2 items are motionless, then they can't agree how fast or how slow they're persisting, so they get them moving. And this gives them a clock or a watch, and so you carry a watch around on your wrist. But time is not motion. Let's escape from that one right now. An error and a heresy to which I myself was prey until fairly recently. We can say, however, number 8, the apparency of time is the change of position of particles in space. Now, if we see particles changing in space, we know time's passing. But if you had one piece of space, and you had 3 particles, so it'd be 3-dimensional space, and you were simply sitting there looking at those particles, and there was absolutely no change in them whatsoever, you would be very hard put to describe, even to yourself, whether any time was passing or not. And so the apparency of time is the change of position of particles in space. All right, let's take up number 9. Change is the primary manifestation of time. You see, if you saw these 3 things motionless, then you would not be able to tell whether time was passing or not, because you might be looking at one time or another. But to prove it, you could say they moved this far at such and such a speed or something of the sort, and you could say, therefore, this much time has gone by. So we would say then that change is the primary manifestation of time. Now, oddly enough, you have then your case 5. Right there. Case 5 is trying to change himself simply because he's in agreement with particles in motion. That's all. He's simply acting on compulsion or obsession to change. And if you ask him very suddenly which direction he's trying to change, he would not be able to tell you. He has no real goal. He doesn't particularly want to be better. He doesn't particularly want to be worse. But he's got to change, got to change, got to change, got to change. He's got to change. He's frantically got to change. Well, why has he got to change? It's because he has these particles all around him which are dictating change to him. They're saying time, 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 time. In other words, they're saying change, 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 change. In other words, he's in agreement with the apparency of time, and he has fallen far, far away from the mere consideration of time. So he doesn't conceive what time is. He becomes a nuclear physicist. Anyway, the highest purpose in the universe is the creation of an effect. Let's get on to that one, 10. I refer you to the factors published in issue 16G of the Journal of Scientology, which is available from the HASI, and which is also in the Auditor's Handbook. The highest purpose in the universe is the creation of an effect. Well, we could do an awful lot with that. We could do a tremendous amount with just that one axiom. And in processing, we would see then good reason to have space and to have particles and everything else, and how all these things get there to create an effect. People want to create an effect. All right, then people are going around looking for an effect, and they get into very interesting states of mind about this sort of thing. They say to themselves, well, let's see now, I caused that effect, but that effect is horrible. Therefore, I can't admit that I caused that effect, so I then throw a lie onto the track and say I didn't cause that effect. The next thing of this is they become an effect. Therefore, if they can't be a cause, they become an effect. So they are the effect of what they caused without admitting what they caused, so now they're an effect. Now, do you know they get even worse than that? Worse than being a total effect? Well, they certainly do. They get way down the line to the point where they're the cause of anything that is an effect. They blame themselves. In other words, a man in Sandusky falls down and breaks a glass of pink lemonade and cuts his little pinky, and this person who was in San Diego at the time hears about that, and they know they must be guilty. And that is that's a complete reversal. Now, here we have cause and effect, and a person can get into a state where he's cause and effect simultaneously. That is to say, any effect he starts to cause, he becomes that effect instantly. He said, I think I'll kill him, and he feels like he's dead. Just bing, bing. We've got to have time in order to witness an effect. Now, there's something else. There's a great many things you could learn in this, and one of the things that you could learn from this primarily is that science is dedicating to observing an effect, and we completely forget that it has no other goal. It does not have any other real goal. Once in a while, a scientist is also an idealist, at which time he wants to use his materials to improve man. But science at large, and particularly when it got over into the field of the mind, was simply a goalless, soulless pursuit, as I've already said in the Auditor's Handbook, and the whole thing of it is just to observe an effect. So these people go around, they observe an effect. You know, they're not really even causing an effect. They just go around observing effect. And they fill notebooks and notebooks and notebooks and notebooks full of effects, 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 effects. And you find out they carry on experiments, not to prove anything, not to do anything, but just to observe an effect. They go around and put a pin in the tail of a rat, and the rat jumps and squeaks, and so they say, and they note it down carefully in the notebook. When you put a pin, they actually put the pin in the end of the rat's tail, and they write it down, because these people can't duplicate. They write it down, and they say, when you put a pin 1 inch from the end of the tail of a rat, he moans. Actually, the rat squeaked. Well, this was an observing effect, the way it's recorded by science. This is so bad that the leading scientist of the day, a fellow by the name of Einstein, Einstein says that all an observer has any right to do is look at a needle. Well, that's all right if he's an observer, but why then does a scientist believe that all he has any right to do is look at a needle? That's the only way you'd ever get anybody to build anything as bad as an atom bomb. You'd only get them to build something bad as an atom bomb if they were incapable of responsibility. And if men were totally incapable of responsibility, if they were just going around observing the effect, why, you'd eventually get them so that they could build an atom bomb. And they would say, well, it isn't my fault, I'm not to blame. Now, the few scientists who did feel badly about this and joined organizations and so forth were promptly fired by the government, some 67 of them. The actual instigators and constructors of the atomic bomb have now, to date, been uniformly fired by the United States government. They had some responsibility. So, the government got that out of the road. Now they've got people who just observe effects and everybody's happy, except the American people one of these days. Now, you could take any one of these axioms, by the way, and blow it up considerably and make an awful lot out of it. Now, let's go into number 11. The considerations resulting in conditions of existence are fourfold. Now, why should I talk to you about that, the conditions of existence? Because I've spent hours and hours here in these lectures talking to you about the conditions of existence. And here they are merely stated in axiomatic form. And in case you are still confused, I invite you to look over 11a, 11b, 11c, and 11d. And that is an exact statement of these conditions of existence: as isness, alter isness, and not isness. We've spent enough hours on that, so let's take up number 12. The primary condition of any universe is that two spaces, energies, or objects must not occupy the same space. When this condition is violated, a perfect duplicate, the apparency of any universe or any part thereof is nulled. Now let's get Korzybski. Let's look at general semantics, and let's find out that he was very careful to demonstrate that two objects could not occupy the same space. In other words, Korzybski was dramatizing preserve the universe, preserve the universe, preserve the universe. Now this one tells you that if two objects can't occupy the same space, you haven't got a universe. And sure enough, if you just ask a pretty clear a lot of times what object can occupy the same space you're occupying, he'll work at it and he'll work at it and work at it. And first thing you know, why, he's capable of doing many things which he was not able to do before. His space straightens out, he can create space again, and so forth. Merely because this mesh universe has been telling him so often that two objects cannot occupy the same space, he has begun to believe it. And he believes this is the most thorough law that he has. So we find a person perfectly contentedly being in a body, believing is a body. Why, he knows that he, a thetan, could not occupy the same space as a body. He knows this is impossible. Two objects can't occupy the same space. He's an object, and his body's an object, so the two can't occupy the same space. Well, actually, this is very interesting, because you'll find that two universes can occupy the same space, and actually do occupy the same space. You'll find the universe of the thetan is occupying the same space as the physical universe. But once he declares that the both of them are occupying the same space, you get an interesting condition. Now, I'm not going to try to take up at this time the perfect duplicate with you. You'll have to prove this to yourself. But it's just enough to say two objects are occupying that space, identically occupying that space, and poof, it's gone. It's just enough. That's just the way you make things vanish. That is, to get its as-isness. And this is why as-isness works and why things disappear when you get their as-isness. Okay. Now here is the oldest thing that man knows. And it starts this way. This is the next one here, 13. Axiom 13. The cycle of actions of the physical universe is create, survive, which is persist, destroy. Now, that's the oldest thing man knows. He knows that the universe goes on the basis of death. Actually, he did know that it went on the basis of death, birth, growth, decay, death, birth, growth, decay, death, birth, growth, decay, and so on. He knew that he had time involved here on a lineal line. Now, the funny part of it is you've got to postulate death to get a cycle of action, and you've got to postulate time to get a linear line. So we're dealing here with one of the most intimate things. Now, in Scientology, we take this old Vedic, we find this, by the way, in the Rig Veda, it's been with man about 10,000 years that I know of, and we find that this is the cycle of action of the physical universe: create, survive, destroy. Now, in Dianetics, I isolated just one portion of this line as a common denominator of all existence, which was survive. And sure enough, any life form is surviving. It is trying to survive, and that is its normal push forward. And that has, incidentally, terrific impact, but it has two other parts, and that is create and destroy. Create, survive, destroy. And survive merely means persist. So all of these things are based on time, and we have the primary consideration that there is time underlying Axiom 13. Now we can go in there with 14 and 15 and 16 and find out that the conditions of existence fit these various portions of the survival curve. And that would be as follows. We find out that survival is accomplished by alter isness and not isness, by which is gained the persistency known as time. That's a mechanical persistency. In other words, we keep changing things, and then saying they aren't, and saying they aren't, and saying they aren't, and changing them, and then pushing them out, and then changing them and pushing them out, and in other words, reforming them and trying to vanish them, pushing them, in other words, using energy to fight energy. Why, we'll get survival. Believe me, we'll get some persistency. There's more to it than that. I invite you to R240 to understand that completely. Now, number 15, creation is accomplished by the postulation of an as-isness. Now, do you know that all you have to say is space, energy, time, that's the way it is. And you could say it's now going to persist. You've added the time to it. That's as-isness. Now, if you immediately after that simply looked at it and got its as-isness again, it'd vanish. All you had to do is get it in the same instant of time, you might say, with the same time postulate, and it would disappear. You could create it to disappear in terms of as-isness. In order to make that as-isness persist, you'd have to alter it, but we've gone into that great deal. Now, 16. Complete destruction is accomplished by the postulation of the as-isness of any existence and the parts thereof. In other words, you want something to disappear, the complete destruction would simply be vanishment. You wouldn't have any rubble left. When you blow something up with guns, you get rubble left. You can ask anybody who was in the last war, and there was an awful lot of broken bricks lying all over the streets. If anybody had really been working at this in a good, sensible way, and he'd really meant total destruction, he would have simply gotten the as-isness of the situation, and zoom, it would have been gone. That would have been the end of that. If you wanted to declare the whole as-isness of a country. If you were able to span that much attention and trace back that many particles that fast to their original points of creation, why, you would, of course, have a vanishment, and that's complete destruction. So complete destruction is as-isness, and also complete vanishment is as-isness. And as-isness, of course, is simply a postulated existence, and what we're looking at most of the time is number 17. The static, having postulated as-isness, then practices alter-isness, and so achieves the apparency of isness, and so obtains reality. In other words, we get a continuous alteration, and we get this apparency called isness. And the static, in practicing not isness, brings about the persistence of unwanted existences, and so brings about unreality. In other words, it's not isness that gives us unreality. And that includes forgetfulness, unconsciousness, and other undesirable states. Quite an important axiom, and a very true one. Okay.
This is a lecture by L. Ron Hubbard given on the 20th of August, 1954. The title of this lecture is Axioms Part 2. This lecture is 27 minutes long. Reproduced by Golden Arrow Productions.
I want to talk to you now some more about the axioms. It's a remarkable thing that life itself can be codified in terms of axioms. It has not been done before. The first time it was attempted is when I wrote up the logics and axioms way back there a couple of years ago. And, well, that's more than that. That's about 3 years ago. And I wrote these things up simply to give an alignment to thought itself. And as a matter of fact, copies of these axioms were sent over to Europe. And just a year ago, I found them in Vienna, fully translated into German, which is quite remarkable. Over there, they were terribly impressed simply because it had not been done. Nobody had codified life to this degree, and nobody had codified psychotherapy. And they were not impressed as to whether they were right or wrong. It's just that nobody had done it before. Well, we're not quite doing the same thing. Here, those axioms were quite complicated, and the axioms which we have here in the summary of Scientology in the Auditor's Handbook are nowhere near as lengthy, but they pack a great deal more punch. Now, let's take up something very, very interesting. Let's take up a proof of ultimate truth. If we have reached an ultimate truth, then we have reached an ultimate solution. And who would ever suspect, really, that an ultimate truth or an ultimate solution could be subjected to mechanical proof? Who would dream this? Well, certainly I never would have dreamed it, and yet we have done just that. Discovered the phenomenon of a perfect duplicate. Now, you'd better know what a perfect duplicate is. We get that in Axiom 20. Bringing the static to create a perfect duplicate causes the vanishment of any existence or part thereof. You understand that if you can get a life form to make a perfect duplicate of anything, it will vanish. Now, that's quite remarkable. We have a perfect duplicate, very, very clearly defined. It is an additional, now get that additional, it's an additional creation of the object, its energy and space, in its own space, its own time, using its own energy. And we could append to that the considerations which go along with it, because it couldn't be anything but considerations. Now, this violates the condition that two objects must not occupy the same space and causes the vanishment of the object. The second that you violate this rule which holds universes together, which is that two objects must not occupy the same space, and we make two objects occupy exactly the same space, why, we get a vanishment. Now, this is quite remarkable. But if you will ask somebody to simply make a perfect duplicate of something, well understanding exactly what a perfect duplicate is, if you ask him to make a perfect duplicate, for instance, of a vase, just exactly where it sits, it will start to fade out on him. And he can do that to almost anything. Now, why doesn't it fade for somebody else? Why doesn't this perfect duplicate fade for somebody else? Well, it's quite remarkable. Do you know that everything in this universe is displaced or misplaced? Now, when we say a lie, we talk about a lie, we really don't mean that simply changing the position of something is a lie. We have to alter the consideration regarding it to make a lie. Now, it isn't really a lie that everything is so scrambled in this universe, but believe me, it's scrambled. Just in the last moment or two, several cosmic rays went through your body. Now, those were all particles. They emanated from someplace else, and they came down where you are. Maybe they've been en route for 100 million years, who knows? And there they are. Now, to get one of those cosmic rays to vanish, it would be necessary to pick its point of creation. And we would have to find its point of creation, and we'd have to make a duplicate of the ray at the moment of its creation. And then we would have to make a duplicate of having done so. And instantly, that cosmic ray would vanish. There is no doubt about this whatsoever. There is how you make a perfect duplicate. Now, If you can make a perfect duplicate and make something disappear, why, you have, of course, achieved a vanishment. And this means then that you have achieved something which is quite interesting. It's very interesting to the physicist. It's very interesting to almost anybody. But it is demonstrable. You can do this. Now, I asked one of our better auditors the other day. He was foolish enough to sit down and let me process him while I was doing something else. And I told him simply to look over to the wall over there and pick a very small area and get the atoms and molecules in the wall there and put an attention unit, a little attention unit, a remote viewpoint, next to each one and follow it immediately back to where it had been created. And he came off of the fender of that car as though he had been shot, because the object itself, this tiny portion of the object, started to disintegrate. And he rushed over to it to hold it into place. Well, it was an interesting experiment, because he'd heard all this, and he didn't quite believe it. But the second that he realized that, it was fine. Well, now, why doesn't the whole universe vanish? Well, let me point out to you that probably on the very site of this building, there was another building once. Where's that other building? It's been broken up, and the bricks have been moved, and part of it's out here in the street, and there's part of it still in the ground below you, and there's part of it maybe has, I don't know, some dust from the brick dust got on somebody's suitcase who went to World War II, and part of it's in Germany, and in other words, it's spread all over the place, and here are all these waves and rays going all over the universe, and to get each one of those at its moment of creation, in the time and space of moment of creation, using itself as its own energy, would be quite a job. And it's not an impossible job. It merely means that it's a job that requires an ability to span attention like mad. You would get, then, a physical object to disappear so thoroughly that everybody else would know it was gone if you got all these various parts. You see, it isn't true that an object sitting before you at this moment, or your chair, has always been in that position. Nor it isn't true that the materials in that chair have always been in that position, nor is it true that the atoms which made up the materials in their raw material form were always in that particular ore bed or in that particular tree. So you see, it's quite complex. This universe is very mixed up. It doesn't mean you can't make it vanish, however. Now, the second that we get this perfect duplicate, and the second we can produce this phenomena, we know we have an ultimate solution. Now, we will go into that much more deeply here when we get to the last part of the axioms. But I merely want to call that to your attention right here, that the perfect duplicate was the little latch string hanging out that opened the door to an ultimate truth. Well, what would an ultimate truth be? Well, we'll take that up a little bit later, but an ultimate truth is a static, and an ultimate solution is a static. In other words, an ultimate truth and an ultimate solution is nothing. You get the as-isness of any problem. You make a perfect duplicate of any problem, and the problem will disappear. Now, you can subject that to truth, too. So if you can make a problem disappear by simply getting its as-isness, then you've got the solution to all problems, haven't you? Well, the meshed universe itself is just a problem. And if you could make it all disappear just by getting its as-isness, it would disappear. It would disappear for everybody. All right. Let's study that and get that very good and get what a definition is there in the Auditor's Handbook. And let's get that definition of a perfect duplicate, and let's understand it very, very well. Because contained right in that is the total solution, by the way, to a mental therapy Dianetics, of which you may have heard something, and the vanishment of engrams, the vanishment of ridges, of all energy forms and manifestations can simply be accomplished by making perfect duplicates of them. That doesn't mean that you should go around trying to make nothing out of everything, or get your pre-clear to try to make nothing out of everything, but it just can be done. If you wanted to make a mess clear, you could use the principle of the perfect duplicate to do it in a very short space of time. He'd not only be clear, he wouldn't have a body either. All right, let's take up number 21. Understanding is composed of affinity, reality, and communication. The understanding that we have of an understanding is, of course, a broad collection of data. That's That's what we would consider understanding. I understand this data. Well, let's get understanding just a little bit better. Do we understand that understanding is simply the ability to get the as-isness of something? In other words, you go around and you say, I don't quite understand this car. And we walk around, I don't quite understand what's wrong with this car. It just won't start, and we walk around, and then we find out we haven't turned on the key. And we turn on the key. We have understood it, in other words. We have unmocked the fact that the key was not turned on, and we have turned on the key. Now that actually is practicing alter-isness. If we walked around this car and said, I don't understand what this object is, I don't understand what this object is, it's a car, we would feel immediately relieved. We feel a lot better about the thing. But if we were to get its total as-isness, there would just be a hole sitting there. So understanding is as-isness, and understanding in its entirety would be a static. And so we have the fact that life knows basically everything there is to know before it gets complicated with lots of data, merely because it can postulate all the data it knows. In other words, all knowingness is inherent in the static itself. A thetan who is in good shape knows everything there is to know. He knows past, present, future. He knows everything. This doesn't mean he knows data. This merely means that he can as-is anything. And if he can as-is anything, believe me, he can understand it. Man's salvation, I have said several times, depends upon his recognition of his brotherhood with the universe. Well, let's misinterpret that just a little bit and say, well, man's salvation, if you wanted me to save him from the universe, would depend upon his ability to make an as-isness of the physical universe, at which moment he wouldn't have a universe. And this would be total understanding. Well, this understanding has three parts, and this is affinity, reality, and communication. Well, I've mentioned that to you before, and we know quite a bit about that. As a matter of fact, there's a total book on this subject. It's an old book and doesn't contain as many refinements as we have today, but affinity, reality, and communication are very, very useful to the auditor. You should understand them very, very well. That's ARC. Now, you can actually take ARC and you can compose out of ARC all the mathematics there are. You can combine ARC into mathematics. You can do anything with ARC that you want to do. Symbolic logic, even calculus could be extrapolated from ARC. It's quite interesting. Affinity depends upon reality and communication. Reality depends upon affinity and communication. Communication depends upon affinity and reality. And as I used to say, if you don't believe this, try to communicate sometime with somebody and don't have any affinity at all. Just get real mad at somebody and try to communicate with him. You won't. Try to get somebody to be reasonable when he is very angry, and you'll find out his reality is very bad. He cannot conceive of the isness of a situation. He will give you some of the weirdest things. There's no liar lying like an angry man. Now, if you raise somebody's affinity, you will raise the reality and communication. If you raise somebody's reality, you will raise their affinity and communication. If you raise somebody's communication, you will raise their affinity and reality. And the keynote of this triangle happens to be communication. Communication is more important than affinity and reality. All right, now let's take up number 22, and we'll find out that the practice of not-isness reduces understanding. In other words, something is there, and we say it's not there. That's a lie, isn't it? We're running down the road like mad, and there's an enormous boulder lying in the middle of the road, and almost anybody just before he has an accident will say the boulder's not there. And by golly, it's there. And this makes him feel that he is a bum thetan. He's failed. Well, the funny part of it is, if he were to say immediately, as is a boulder in the road, instead of denying the situation, and if he could do this, a perfect duplicate, well, the boulder would disappear. But he doesn't do it that way. He sort of puts some energy up there and sort of pushes against the boulder, and he says, it's not there, I deny it. Well, he'll have a mighty thin understanding of the whole thing. He doesn't want to communicate with it, so he says it's not there. He doesn't want to have any affinity for it at all, so he said it isn't there. And believe me, his reality cuts down. After somebody's lost something or been through an accident, you would be surprised how poor their perception is, how poor their reality is. Everything looks very dim to them. They don't like it. And that means their communication is off, their affinity is off. They don't like the world. They feel sad and so forth. Well, the practice of not-isness reduces understanding, and that is what man is doing all the time. He's trying to avow that something that isn't there is there, and he's trying to avow that something that is there isn't there, and between these two things, giving it no as-isness at all, or alter-isness, or new postulates of any kind, he's having a lot of fun. Well, I don't know. Some people claim it's fun anyway. All right. Number 23. The static has the capability of total knowingness. Total knowingness would consist of total ARC. Well, we've just covered that. Here we have a condition of existence which is as is. That'd be total knowingness. Well, if we had somebody who could say as is to everything and trace all parts of everything back to the original time, spot, and so forth, and simply get them as they really were, we, of course, would have nothing left but a static. Naturally, we would not have anything else but a static. We would have zero. We wouldn't even have space. Now, that's why we say the static has capability of total knowingness. Total knowingness would consist of total ARC. By the way, if you wanted to make this whole universe vanish, you would have to be able to span this whole universe. You'd have to be as big as the universe. And that isn't, by the way, very hard to do. You can drill somebody up to a point where you can do that. But if you go into that, to getting to make an as-isness of it, would you please let me know first? I've got a couple of old hats and a motorcycle and so forth that I'd like to alter very quickly at the moment he does this, so I'd at least be left with those. Now, number 24 is total ARC would bring about the vanishment of all mechanical conditions of existence. Now remember, all mechanical conditions of existence. It wouldn't bring about the sudden death of everything. It would bring about the exteriorization of everything. It would mean the vanishment of all space and all form. Mechanics. Now, you want to differentiate between a consideration and a postulate and a mechanic. You want to get the difference between a quality, such as complete trust, a quality such as full responsibility, and the mechanics. Now, you get somebody who is a step 5 or step 6 or step 10, and you'll get one of these fellows, and he will be all out for mechanics, and he won't have anything to do with considerations. And he will believe completely that considerations are, well, they're no good. Mechanics are the thing. You know, you can put your hands on it. You can feel it. You can touch it. Well, he has to be made thoroughly acquainted with the existence of these mechanics before he could as-is them enough so that he could get up to a point where he would have the ability to consider. That's why opening procedure of 8C works. He is sunk below the level of mechanics. Well, when we say mechanics, we mean space, energy, objects, and time. And when something has those things in it, we're talking about something mechanical. All right. That's all it would vanish if you as-ised all of existence. It would just be the mechanics, and you could turn right around and postulate them all back again, too. Great ease. Well, only if you do this, why, don't postulate them back with any politicians. We've had too many of them. Generals, too. You can omit the generals. Don't give them any mechanical forms. Number 25, these axioms and definitions. Affinity is a scale of attitude which falls away from the coexistence of static through the interpositions of distance and energy to create identity down to close proximity but mystery. My, isn't that complicated? That is very, very complicated. Well, let's get this fairly straight, and let's realize that we probably could simplify that particular axiom. We probably, if it's complicated like that, we probably don't know all there is to know about it. I probably got a blank spot here someplace. But affinity is simply a matter of distance in terms of mechanics. Now, the second we get out of considerations and go into mechanics, what is affinity? Well, affinity is basically a consideration, so it isn't a mechanic at all. But it does represent itself mechanically. There are mechanical representations of it. For instance, total knowingness goes down to lookingness. You have to look to find out. Well, that's different than simply knowing without looking. Now we go down to looking. Now we go just a little bit lower than that. This is, by the way, an affinity scale. We go into emotion and look, and then we no longer no longer have knowledge by looking. We have to have knowledge by emotion. Do we like it? Do we dislike it? Emotionally. There are particles in emotion. I don't like it. In other words, I have some anger particles about it, or I have some resentment particles. And you, by the way, a preclear has his bank full of these emotional particles. Now, if I have to feel it to know it's there, I've gone immediately into effort. My affinity for something would be good if I could feel it, and it would be no good at all if I can't feel it. You get a step 5 who is swearing by mechanics and swearing at all life forms, and who builds atom bombs and things like that, and we get this step 5 telling you that he cannot contact life. He cannot contact life. So therefore, we can't contact this thing called static, so therefore he can't believe in it. Well, this is very interesting. You ask him why, and he said, well, I can't feel it. Well, he's twisting the snake around so it'll eat its tail or something. He's proving it all upside down and backwards. He says he can't get the existence of something he can't feel. Well, the odd part of it is we can measure electronically the existence of life. There's a little meter which we run some tests on, and we can actually demonstrate that one individual can turn on in another individual at some great distance from him a considerable electrical current, enough to make this little machine sit up and sing. And the other person can turn it on at will, and the person on whom it's being turned on can't stop it. This means that here's a manifestation which can be measured. We've done the impossible there, too. We've done the impossible in many places in Scientology. You can't measure a static, but we've done so by making one person at a distance bring a mechanic into being. Now, affinity is this scale. It goes down through effort. When a person gets down to effort, then he's into a level where he's got to work. Everything has got to be work. He's got to touch everything and feel everything before he can know anything. A person in that band, by the way, as he gets to the lower part of that band, has facsimiles. He'll even do weird things like this. He will get a picture to know what's happening to him. In other words, he will get a picture of an incident to get an idea. He gets the picture and then he gets the idea. He doesn't get the idea and then get a picture. You want to watch that. Sometime or another you'll find a preclear is doing this. Your preclear, you'll be saying, all right, now get the idea of being perfect. And your preclear will sit there and say, I got it. You want to ask him, how did you do that? That's a wonderful question to ask a preclear at any time. How did you do that? And he'll say, why, of course, just like everybody else. I got this picture, and this picture came up, and I looked at it, and the picture said, be perfect. And so forth, and it showed me a circle. So a circle, that's perfect. So that's where your preclear was doing that. He wasn't making the postulate at all. He was waiting for a picture to come up and tell him what it was all about. Well, now we go down from effort into thinking, and then we get our figure case. Now, he's a hard boy to deal along with because he can't work. He feels that his thought, by the way, is a colloquialism. Really, life is not composed of thought, particularly. It's composed of space and action and all sorts of things. The static can do all these things. It's not necessarily pure thought. If you've got a hangover about pure thought from the field of Christianity, why, get rid of it. Because thinkingness comes in clear down below effort. And it comes in as figure. Now, a person can postulate without thinking about it. If that's what we mean by thought, that's fine. But usually what people mean by thought is figure. I'll just figure this out, and I'll get a computation, a calculation, and I'll add it up to, now let me see, can you go to the movies? I don't know, they said when you were a little kid. Now let me see, I'll have to think it over. Give me a couple of days. We don't know how all of this mechanic got into a postulate, but they've let it get in there. So that's our level of thinkingness. Now we go downstairs from thinkingness on this scale, and we get in symbolizingness. Symbolizingness is very interesting. A symbol contains mass, meaning, and mobility. What is the definition of a symbol? A symbol is something that's being handled from an orientation point, a point which is motionless in relationship to the symbol. It's motionless, the symbol's in motion, and the symbol of that orientation point has mass, meaning, and mobility. Where are you from? I am from New Jersey. This fellow is telling you that he is from an orientation point called New Jersey. and it's motionless, and as he runs around the world, he's always from New Jersey. He has mass, meaning, and mobility. He has a name, he has mass, and so forth. Well, when a person drops down the line below figure, they're into a point of where they figure with symbols. Now, that's a condensation, isn't it? Now, each one of these was a condensation. The next one down the line below symbols is eatingness. You know, animals eat animals. Animals are symbols, and they eat other symbols. And they think they have to stay alive merely by eating other symbols. This is real cute, and eating is quite important. Of course, it can be a lot of fun. But here you have a real condensation. In other words, effort got so condensed that it turned into an inverted kind of thought. And that became so condensed that it packaged thinking is what took place there. It became so condensed, it became a symbol. A word, for instance, is a whole package of thought. So packaged thinking is a symbol, and packaged symbols are a plate of beans. Got that? All right. Now, below that, when a person doesn't believe he can eat anymore, when he thinks he's not going to survive, and so forth, he will go into the sex band. As a witness of that, if you starve cattle or something like that for a while, they'll start to breed. And if you feed them too well, they'll stop breeding. Quite irrational, but then who said any of this was rational? Your cattle who are starved or lacking certain food elements will decide, well, we'll live again in some other generation. And they'll breed up a lot of calves. Of course, there's nothing to feed the calves on, but they haven't paid much attention to that. Now, here in Arizona, we have an interesting fact. We have some very beautiful cattle who have stopped breeding. They've just been too well fed. The way you'd get those cattle breeding again is you would simply start starving them, and you would get them breeding. Now, down below sex, then, Freud, by the way, he was so condensed he had to get clear down there to that condensation of sex. And down below sex, we have a new level of knowingness, only that, this time, is mystery. And the level of mystery. Now, mystery, of course, is a complete displacement of everything which is in a terrific confusion. The anatomy of mystery, by the way, is unprediction, confusion, and then total blank out. Now that, you see, first he couldn't predict some particles, and then this seemed awfully confusing to him, and so he just shut it all off and said, I won't look at it anymore. That's what mystery is, and your step level 5s, by the way, are very, very concerned about mystery. They are very concerned about thinkingness. They're trying to solve the mystery. Well, the mystery is already solved in an ultimate truth. An ultimate solution, of course, is simply the as-isness of the problem. And the as-isness of mystery is simply mystery. And that's really all there is to it. There really is nothing to know back of a mystery, except the mystery itself. It's just its as-isness. But it's always pretending there's something to know earlier than the mystery. Okay.